The glacier stretched endlessly across the horizon, a vast expanse of ice that seemed to breathe with its own ancient rhythm. The wind howled like a mournful spirit, carving jagged patterns into the frozen surface as if trying to tell stories older than time itself. Beneath this desolate beauty lay secrets buried deep within the heart of the ice, secrets that had slumbered for millennia, untouched by human hands or curiosity. But today, something stirred in the depths, something neither human nor beast. A lone figure trudged through the snowstorm, his silhouette barely visible against the white chaos swirling around him. His breath came in ragged bursts, each exhale freezing instantly into crystalline clouds before vanishing into the void. He was clad in layers of worn thermal gear, patched together from scraps salvaged during desperate times. A rifle hung loosely across his back, but it wasn't what he sought here, not today. In one hand, he clutched an old map, brittle and yellowed with age, while the other gripped a climbing axe whose blade gleamed faintly despite the dull light. His name didn't matter. No one would remember it after what happened next. The map led him to this place, a jagged fissure splitting the glacier like a wound on the Earth's skin. Steam rose faintly from the crack, curling upward in ghostly tendrils before dissipating into nothingness. It was unnatural, defying the logic of cold and ice. Yet there was something more, an energy pulsing beneath the surface, vibrating through the soles of his boots and resonating in his chest. He knelt at the edge of the fissure, peering down into the abyss. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering as though alive, and the air smelled metallic, sharp, and alien. He hesitated only briefly before descending, driven by forces he couldn't fully understand. Perhaps it was greed, perhaps desperation, or maybe just the insatiable hunger for discovery that had plagued humanity since its inception. Whatever it was, it propelled him forward, step by treacherous step, until he reached the cavern below. Inside, the world changed entirely. The ice glowed faintly blue, casting an ethereal light over everything. Stalactites hung like teeth from the ceiling, dripping not water but some viscous liquid that shimmered iridescently before freezing mid-air. And then he saw her, the alien queen. She was massive, her form both horrifying and mesmerizing. Her body twisted unnaturally, covered in plates of chitinous armor that reflected the icy glow. Long tendrils writhed behind her, twitching like serpents ready to strike. But what caught his attention most were the two swords embedded in her back, their hilts protruding grotesquely from between her armored plates. They weren't ordinary weapons. They pulsed faintly, as if alive, radiating heat even in this frozen tomb. Their blades were blackened steel etched with runes that shifted when you looked away, leaving you unsure whether they'd been there at all. For a moment, he simply stared, unable to move. She turned her head slowly, her eyes glowing molten gold, and let out a low growl that reverberated through the chamber. Fear clawed at his throat, but curiosity rooted him to the spot. Who had stabbed those swords into her? Why hadn't she removed them? And why did they call to him now, whispering promises he couldn't quite hear? As he took a cautious step closer, the ground trembled beneath his feet. The queen shifted, her movements deliberate yet restrained, as though bound by invisible chains. He realized then that the swords weren't merely lodged in her flesh, they were holding her captive, pinning her to this icy prison. Someone, or something, had left her here, trapped and waiting. And now, inexplicably, fate had brought him to her side. The man stood frozen, his mind racing with questions that refused to settle. What could possibly possess someone to leave such a creature imprisoned in the heart of a glacier? Was she dangerous? Deadly? Or was she merely misunderstood, another victim of fear and misunderstanding? The sword seemed to hum softly, their vibrations syncing with the rhythm of his heartbeat. Each pulse sent a shiver coursing through him, urging him forward, compelling him to act. His gloved fingers twitched involuntarily, drawn toward the hilt of one sword. He clenched his fist tightly, trying to resist the pull, but the sensation only grew stronger. It wasn't fear driving him anymore, it was something deeper, primal. As though the swords themselves were calling out, pleading for release. He glanced again at the queen. Her golden eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his breath hitch. There was intelligence there, raw and ancient, and something else too, pain. Her massive frame quivered slightly, the muscles beneath her armored exoskeleton tensing and relaxing in slow, labored movements. She wasn't fighting him, she was waiting. taking a hesitant step closer. He extended his hand, the tips of his fingers brushing against the hilt of the first sword. The moment contact was made, a jolt shot through his arm, electric and searing, yet strangely exhilarating. Images flooded his mind, flashes of battles fought under alien skies, civilizations rising and falling, and countless faces screaming in terror or triumph. He staggered backward, clutching his head as the visions overwhelmed him. When the storm subsided, he found himself kneeling on the icy floor, gasping for air. The queen let out a low rumble, almost like a purr, and tilted her head slightly. For the first time, he noticed the intricate carvings etched into the base of the sword's hilts, symbols that matched none he'd ever seen before. They glowed faintly now, responding to his touch, and he felt a strange kinship with them, as though they recognized him. Slowly, deliberately, he rose to his feet and approached her once more. This time, when he grasped the hilt of the first sword, he braced himself for the surge of energy. It came again, but instead of recoiling, he leaned into it, letting the power flow through him. The runes along the blade flared brighter, casting long shadows across the cavern walls. With a grunt of effort, he pulled. At first, the sword resisted, lodged deeply in the queen's flesh, but then it began to slide free with a sickening wet sound. The queen roared, a deafening cry that shook the very foundations of the glacier, and thrashed violently. Instinctively, he threw himself to the side, narrowly avoiding being crushed by one of her flailing limbs. When the first sword finally came loose, the room fell eerily silent. The queen stilled, her breathing heavy and labored, and turned her gaze back to him. There was gratitude in her expression, but also urgency. She shifted slightly, exposing the second sword more clearly. This one seemed darker, its aura heavier, almost oppressive. He hesitated, gripping the hilt of the first sword tightly as if drawing strength from it. Could he do this again? Should he? But there was no turning back now. Taking a deep breath, he stepped closer once more, reaching for the second sword. As his fingers closed around its hilt, the temperature in the cavern plummeted sharply, frost forming instantly on his gloves. The runes on this blade pulsed erratically, their light flickering like a dying star. Pulling it free would be harder, he could feel it already, but he knew he had no choice. The queen needed him, and somehow, he needed her too. With every ounce of strength he possessed, he yanked the second sword free. The resulting shockwave knocked him off his feet, sending him sprawling onto the icy ground. Above him, the queen reared back, her entire body convulsing as if awakening from a long slumber. The cavern trembled violently, chunks of ice raining down from the ceiling. Scrambling to his feet, he watched in awe as she stretched her massive wings, wings he hadn't noticed before, and let out another thunderous roar. This time, it wasn't a cry of pain or anger. It was a declaration, a proclamation of freedom. And yet, as she loomed over him, her golden eyes blazing with newfound vitality, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The queen's gaze lingered on him, her molten eyes piercing through the haze of frost and fear. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something akin to recognition in her expression, perhaps even gratitude. But then her massive form shifted, and the cavern seemed to shrink around her. The air thickened, charged with an energy that prickled against his skin. He tightened his grip on the two swords, their weight unfamiliar yet oddly comforting in his hands. They pulsed faintly, as if attuned to the queen's presence, and he wondered if they were communicating with her, or with him. She lowered her head, bringing her face close enough that he could see the intricate patterns etched into her chitinous armor. They shimmered faintly, mirroring the runes on the sword's blades. A low hum emanated from her throat, resonating with the vibrations of the weapons. It was then that he realized, these swords weren't just tools of war. They were keys to understanding, to unlocking something far greater than himself. The ground beneath them groaned ominously, the glacier protesting the sudden release of energy. Cracks spiderwebbed across the icy walls, widening with each passing second. The queen let out a guttural growl, her body coiling like a spring. She was preparing to move, to leave this place where she had been imprisoned for who knows how long. But she didn't attack him. Instead, she nudged one of her massive limbs toward the exit, gesturing, or so it seemed, for him to follow. He hesitated, torn between instinct and reason. Following her meant stepping into the unknown, abandoning everything familiar. Yet staying behind felt equally impossible. The swords vibrated insistently in his hands, their power intertwining with his resolve. Whatever destiny awaited him beyond this cavern, he knew he couldn't turn away from it now. Taking a cautious step forward, he moved toward the fissure leading upward. The queen followed, her movements deliberate but restrained, as though mindful of the fragile environment surrounding them. As they ascended, the cracks in the glacier widened further, releasing plumes of steam that obscured their path. The temperature fluctuated wildly, alternating between biting cold and searing heat. He stumbled once, nearly losing his footing, but a tendril from the queen steadied him, wrapping gently around his waist before retracting. It was a gesture of protection, or perhaps trust. When they finally emerged into the open air, the sight that greeted them was surreal. The glacier had begun to collapse, great chunks of ice calving off into the abyss below. The sky above churned with dark clouds, lightning illuminating the horizon in flashes of blinding brilliance. The wind howled louder than ever, carrying with it the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and alien. The queen spread her wings fully for the first time, their span dwarfing even the largest predators he'd ever encountered. They shimmered with an iridescent sheen, catching the light in ways that defied explanation. She let out a triumphant roar, the sound echoing across the barren landscape. Then, without warning, she launched herself into the air, her wings beating powerfully against the storm. He watched her rise higher and higher, disappearing into the tempestuous clouds. For a moment, he thought she had abandoned him. But then, a shadow descended swiftly, blotting out the dim light. The queen landed mere feet away, her golden eyes locking onto his once more. She lowered her head, bowing slightly, an act of acknowledgement, or perhaps invitation. Clutching the swords tightly, he stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. This journey was far from over. The queen's massive form loomed over him, her golden eyes glowing with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the storm raging around them. Her wings spread wide, casting a shadow that enveloped him completely, yet he felt no fear, only a strange sense of purpose. She let out a low rumble, the sound reverberating in his chest like the tolling of some ancient bell. It wasn't a command or a threat, it was an invitation, one he couldn't refuse even if he wanted to. He took another step forward, his boots crunching against the icy ground. The swords in his hands pulsed faintly, their energy syncing with the rhythm of the queen's breathing. He could feel their power coursing through him, as though they were alive and feeding off his resolve. Each beat of her wings sent gusts of wind whipping past him, carrying shards of ice and fragments of memory. Visions of battles fought under alien skies, civilizations consumed by fire and frost, and beings whose forms defied comprehension. The queen lowered herself slightly, angling her body so that one of her massive limbs extended toward him. At first, he thought she meant for him to climb onto her back, but then he noticed something else, a faint glow emanating from beneath her armored plates, pulsing in time with the sword's vibrations. Whatever bond had formed between them was growing stronger, weaving threads of connection neither fully understood nor controlled. Taking a deep breath, he reached out cautiously, placing a gloved hand on her limb. The moment his fingers made contact, a surge of warmth shot through him, chasing away the biting cold. Images flooded his mind again, this time clearer, more vivid. He saw himself standing amidst ruins older than humanity itself, wielding the two swords against enemies both monstrous and mechanical. He saw the queen beside him, her presence unwavering, her strength unmatched. And he saw something else. A void, vast and unending, swallowing stars whole. Within it, a single point of light flickered, fragile but persistent. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving him disoriented and gasping for air. The queen let out another low growl, nudging him gently with her limb. He steadied himself, gripping the swords tightly once more. Whatever lay ahead, he realized, would demand everything he had, and perhaps more. With a final glance at the collapsing glacier behind him, he climbed onto her back. Her armor was surprisingly smooth beneath his touch, warm despite the freezing winds howling around them. As soon as he settled into position, she rose into the air with a powerful thrust of her wings. The world fell away below them, swallowed by clouds and chaos. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating jagged peaks and endless expanses of ice. The storm raged on, but within its fury, there was a strange harmony, a symphony of destruction and renewal. As they ascended higher, the air grew thinner, colder, almost unbearable. Yet the swords radiated heat, shielding him from the worst of it. Their runes flared brightly now, casting eerie shadows across the queen's wings. He clung to her armor, his knuckles white with effort, as they broke through the uppermost layer of clouds. What awaited them above was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The sky here was not blue but a swirling tapestry of colors, violet, crimson, gold, all shifting and blending seamlessly. Strange shapes moved within the haze, too fast to discern clearly. They weren't birds or machines but something entirely otherworldly, their forms fluid and ever-changing. The atmosphere crackled with energy, each breath feeling electric, charged with latent potential. The queen let out a piercing cry, her voice cutting through the cacophony of the storm. In response, the shapes darted closer, encircling them in a chaotic dance. They didn't attack though. Instead, they seemed curious, drawn to the sword's glow and the queen's immense presence. One of the creatures, a serpentine being with translucent scales and multiple sets of luminous eyes, approached cautiously, hovering just out of reach. Its gaze lingered on him, studying him intently before retreating back into the swarm. "Where are we?" he whispered aloud, though he knew there would be no answer. The question hung in the air, unanswered yet somehow irrelevant. This place existed beyond human understanding, a realm where logic bent and reality fractured. The queen banked sharply, her wings slicing through the kaleidoscopic sky with effortless grace. Below them stretched a landscape that defied description, an endless expanse of floating islands suspended in midair, connected by bridges of light and shadow. Towering spires jutted upward from some of the larger landmasses, their surfaces etched with symbols similar to those on the swords. Rivers of liquid starlight flowed between the islands, cascading into abyssal chasms that glowed faintly with an inner luminescence. She descended toward one of the larger islands, her movements deliberate and precise. As they drew nearer, he noticed structures scattered across its surface, buildings unlike any he'd ever seen, their architecture both alien and hauntingly familiar. Some resembled cathedrals, their spires reaching skyward, while others looked like organic growths, twisting and curling as if alive. Between these structures stood statues, humanoid figures carved from obsidian and marble, their faces obscured by intricate masks. The queen landed softly on the edge of the island, folding her wings neatly against her sides. She turned her head toward him, her golden eyes gleaming with anticipation, or perhaps warning. Whatever awaited them here, it was clear she intended for him to face it alongside her. Sliding off her back, he planted his feet firmly on the ground, which shimmered faintly beneath his weight. The swords vibrated insistently in his hands, their energy resonating with the environment around them. He took a cautious step forward, scanning the horizon for signs of movement. The air was eerily silent now, save for the soft hum of the swords and the distant rush of starlit rivers. A sudden shift in the atmosphere made him pause. The colors of the sky darkened, bleeding into shades of indigo and black. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching across the ground like grasping fingers. From the nearest structure emerged a figure, a humanoid silhouette cloaked in tattered robes that seemed woven from darkness itself. Its face was hidden beneath a mask identical to those adorning the statues, its edges glowing faintly with an ominous red light. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at him. Behind it, more shapes began to emerge from the shadows, their forms indistinct but undeniably hostile. The queen let out a low growl, positioning herself protectively between him and the advancing horde. Her wings unfurled slightly, ready to strike or shield as needed. He tightened his grip on the swords, their warmth anchoring him amidst the encroaching dread. Whatever battle awaited them here, he knew it would test not only his strength but his very soul. And yet, as he stood there facing the unknown, he felt no regret, only determination. For better or worse, this journey had become his destiny. The figure in the tattered robes stepped forward, its movements unervingly fluid, as though it glided rather than walked. The mask it wore seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the red glow intensifying with each step it took. Behind it, the shadowy horde spread out, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke given life. They didn't speak or make any sound, but their presence alone was suffocating, a weight pressing down on his chest, threatening to crush him beneath its enormity. The queen let out a low, guttural roar, her body coiling tightly as if preparing to strike. Her wings flared outward, casting long shadows that mingled with the encroaching darkness. The air around them crackled with tension, charged by the opposing forces, the queen's radiant power and the oppressive void exuded by the masked figure and its followers. He tightened his grip on the swords, their vibrations growing erratic, almost frantic. It was as though they recognized the enemy before them, reacting instinctively to the threat. The runes etched into their blades flared brightly, illuminating the immediate area with an otherworldly light. He could feel their energy coursing through him, bolstering his resolve even as doubt clawed at the edges of his mind. Who, or what, were these beings? And why did they seem so intent on stopping him? The masked figure stopped just a few paces away, tilting its head slightly as if studying him. Then, without warning, it raised both arms, and the ground beneath them began to tremble violently. Cracks splintered across the shimmering surface of the island, glowing faintly with the same ominous red light as the figure's mask. From the fissures emerged more creatures, twisted amalgamations of flesh and metal, their eyes burning with hatred. They moved with mechanical precision, surrounding them in a tightening circle. "Stay close," he muttered under his breath, though whether he was speaking to himself or the queen, he wasn't sure. She responded with a low rumble, her massive frame shifting protectively beside him. Together, they formed an unspoken alliance, two beings bound by circumstance and purpose, facing an enemy neither fully understood. One of the metallic creatures lunged first, its claws gleaming wickedly in the dim light. The queen reacted instantly, swiping one of her powerful limbs and sending the creature crashing into the nearest structure. Stone shattered upon impact, sending shards flying in all directions. But for every foe she dispatched, two more seemed to take its place. The horde was endless, spilling forth from the cracks like water breaching a dam. Realizing they couldn't hold this position indefinitely, he stepped forward, raising the swords high. Their glow intensified, bathing the battlefield in a radiant light that momentarily stunned the advancing enemies. Taking advantage of the distraction, he swung the first sword in a wide arc, releasing a wave of energy that cut through several of the creatures at once. They dissolved into ash, their forms disintegrating before they hit the ground. Encouraged by the success, he pressed onward, striking with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed. Each blow resonated with the sword's power, amplifying his strength tenfold. Yet with every strike, he felt a piece of himself being drained, his stamina, his focus, his very essence. The swords demanded a price, and he was paying it willingly, driven by desperation and the need to survive. The queen fought alongside him with equal determination, her massive form a whirlwind of destruction. Her tendrils lashed out, impaling multiple foes at once, while her wings created gusts strong enough to scatter the smaller creatures like leaves in a storm. Despite their combined efforts, however, the tide showed no sign of turning. For every enemy they felled, more emerged, relentless and unyielding. Then, the masked figure finally acted. With a sharp gesture, it summoned a swirling vortex of shadows directly above them. The darkness descended rapidly, enveloping everything in its path. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the cacophony of battle faded into an eerie silence. All he could hear was the steady thrum of the swords in his hands and the rhythmic beating of his own heart. Instinctively, he reached out with one hand, finding the queen's armored side. Her warmth anchored him amidst the suffocating void, grounding him when all else threatened to overwhelm. "We can't stay here," he whispered hoarsely, unsure if she could understand him. But she responded immediately, nudging him gently toward what he assumed was the direction of the vortex's edge. They moved cautiously, the sword's light barely piercing the oppressive gloom. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the shadows themselves sought to pull them back. He slashed blindly at the darkness, hoping to clear a path, but the void simply swallowed the energy, leaving them trapped within its grasp. Suddenly, the queen let out a deafening roar, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The sound reverberated through the vortex, causing the shadows to ripple and distort. Seizing the opportunity, she surged forward, dragging him along with her. The force of her movement propelled them out of the vortex and into open space once more. They landed hard on the shimmering ground, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. Gasping for air, he rolled onto his back, staring up at the kaleidoscopic sky now marred by streaks of black. The horde had regrouped, their numbers undiminished, but there was something different about them now. They hesitated, their attention drawn elsewhere. Following their gaze, he saw the masked figure standing atop one of the obsidian statues, its arms raised high. The red glow of its mask pulsed wildly, syncing with the rhythm of the swords in his hands. It was then that he realized, the figure wasn't merely commanding the horde, it was drawing power from them, channeling their collective energy into some greater purpose. And whatever that purpose was, it involved him. The queen let out another roar, snapping him out of his thoughts. She positioned herself between him and the figure, her body tense and ready to strike. But before either of them could act, the masked figure lowered its arms, pointing directly at him. A beam of crimson light shot forth, striking the ground mere inches from where he stood. The impact sent shock waves rippling outward, forcing him to stumble backward. Desperation surged within him, fueling his resolve. Clutching the swords tightly, he charged forward, ignoring the fatigue weighing down his limbs. The horde closed in around him, but he cut through them with renewed vigor, each swing of the swords carving paths of destruction. The queen followed closely behind, her presence a constant reminder that he wasn't alone. As he neared the statue, the masked figure leapt down, landing gracefully before him. Up close, its mask seemed even more menacing, the red glow searing into his vision. It raised a hand, and he braced himself for another attack, but instead of striking, it spoke. Its voice was not human, a distorted blend of whispers and echoes that reverberated in his skull. "You carry the keys," it intoned, gesturing toward the swords. "But do you truly understand what they unlock?" He froze, uncertainty creeping into his mind. What did it mean? Were the swords truly keys, as the figure claimed? And if so, what door awaited them beyond this battlefield? Before he could respond, the queen intervened, slamming one of her massive limbs into the figure and sending it sprawling. The horde surged forward again, their attacks fiercer than ever. Exhaustion clawed at him, threatening to drag him under, but he refused to yield. Not yet. Not while the truth remained just out of reach. With a final cry of defiance, he drove the swords into the ground, unleashing a burst of energy that illuminated the entire island. The horde faltered, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The masked figure staggered, its mask flickering erratically before shattering entirely. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, the ground beneath them began to quake once more, and the sky above fractured like glass. Whatever had been unleashed, it was far from over. The fractured sky above them split open, revealing a churning void that pulsed with an ominous light. The queen let out a low growl, her body trembling as if sensing the gravity of what was to come. He pulled the swords from the ground, their glow dimming slightly but still steady in his hands. "We've done something," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "But what?" The masked figure, now unmasked and revealed as a shadowy wisp, floated upward toward the rift. It turned back briefly, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You have only begun," it whispered, its voice carrying both warning and inevitability. Then, it vanished into the void. The quaking grew violent, cracks spreading across the island like veins. The queen nudged him urgently, gesturing toward her back. There was no time to hesitate. He climbed aboard, gripping the swords tightly as she launched herself into the air. Below, the floating islands began to collapse, consumed by the expanding rift. The kaleidoscopic colors bled away, replaced by an endless expanse of darkness. Lightning arced through the void, illuminating glimpses of colossal shapes moving just beyond sight. As they ascended higher, the queen's wings beat furiously against the pull of the abyss. Her golden eyes locked onto his, filled with determination, and perhaps fear. Whatever awaited them next, they would face it together. The swords pulsed faintly, their energy syncing with the rhythm of their flight. He glanced down at them, realizing for the first time how much they had changed him. They weren't just weapons. They were burdens, responsibilities he hadn't asked for but couldn't abandon. Ahead, the void stretched endlessly, swallowing stars and galaxies whole. Yet within its depths, he saw something, a faint glimmer of hope. A single point of light, fragile but persistent, calling to him. The queen roared, angling her body toward the light. For a moment, everything seemed possible. Then, without warning, the rift surged, pulling them downward with unstoppable force. "Hold on!" he shouted, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to. Himself? The queen? Or the universe itself? And as they plummeted into the unknown, the swords flared one final time, bathing them in radiant light.